Hi folks, Matt Easton here, and I'm here at Olympia Auctions today. Now the reason I'm here is we have an absolutely amazing auction coming up on the 26th. I'll put a link below so you can find out more details about the full amazing selection of things coming up in this auction. But today we're going to be looking at some of the key pieces, and in future videos some other pieces that are in this auction as well. And there are some really amazing things here that haven't seen public eyes and haven't been available for sale in some cases for decades. So I'm really excited to be showing to you some of these things here today. So for this first video we're going to be looking at a couple of swords, and you can see I've got an array of amazing swords behind me here, including some 15th century swords all the way through 16th, 17th century up to that massive great two-handed sword behind me. But we're going to be looking at two swords from a famous, dare I say, legendary group of swords known as the Castillon swords. That's right, there are two Castillon swords coming up for sale in this auction on the 26th, link below. And we're going to be looking at two of those here. Now, the Castillon hoard is a group of swords supposedly found in the River Dordogne in France and associated with the Battle of Castillon, which happened at the end of the 100 Years' War. This has been widely written about by people like Ewart Oakeshott and Clive Thomas, and some of the originals you can go to see in places today like the Royal Armouries in Leeds, but there are two of them for sale in this auction. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Castillon group of swords, in fact it's not just swords, there were also daggers in there as well, consists of about 100 objects, of which probably 80 or 90 were swords. And of that group, they split into two main groups known as Type A and Type B. Generally speaking, one group has wheel pommels, one group has fishtail pommels, and there are two main types of crossguard. There are some exceptions as well, but there are two main types of crossguard shown in those two groups also. And they, at least according to our current research, probably date to the 1450s. If we assume they're associated with the Battle of Castillon, then they'd have to predate that battle, 1453. But possibly if they're not associated with that battle, but just generally speaking that period in France, then they could be a little bit earlier, they could be a little bit later. So generally speaking, we tend to date them to about 1440 to 1460. Now, of that group of about 100 objects, most of them were one-handed swords, which you or I might commonly know as arming swords. That is the type of sword that a knight or a billman or an archer or a crossbowman might wear at their side, usually as a secondary weapon, where their primary weapon was something like a bow or a crossbow or a lance or a poleaxe. So it's their sidearm, and these are good quality swords made in a variety of locations according to the maker's marks on them, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go into this video. But most of them in the group are one-handed swords. However, there were some two-handed swords, although they were in the minority, as indeed two-handed swords were in a minority in this period. Now, you might know that I've studied one of the examples of one of the two-handed swords from this group in the Royal Armouries, and that is kept by them to this day, and that is the largest sword in the group as far as I'm aware, and that is a very big, it's like a giant longsword. It's a two-handed sword, true two-handed sword really. You couldn't use it one-handed. What we're going to be looking at today are two of the very rare long swords. So they are hand and a half swords. They're swords that can be used in two hands or one hand. Now, prior to today, I have only seen these swords in publications, in books and in Park Lane Arms Fair catalogues written about by people like Ewart Oakeshott. So I am familiar with these swords. I didn't know of the existence of these swords, but they have been in a private collection for, I think, a couple of decades at least. So they haven't been in a museum, they haven't been within public sight, they haven't been published or measured or anything like this. It's absolutely amazing to be seeing them today, and I'm really happy to be able to share it with you. So here is the first longsword of this pair. This is lot 147 in the upcoming auction. Again, I'll put a link below. Now, this is an absolutely beautifully proportioned longsword with a Type 18 Ewart typology, Ewart Oakeshott typology Type 18 blade. Double-edged, very slightly hollow ground blade. The blade is about 104 centimetres long and the total length is 131 centimetres. Now, of course, one of the great things about being up close and personal with a sword like this and being able to get my hands on it, my gloved hands of course, is that I have my calipers here. Now, I know a lot of you will be interested to know what the distal taper of such a sword is, and it is very close to 1 centimetre. It's 9.8 millimetres at the base here. About halfway up the blade, it's 7.4 millimetres, and up near the tip, it's about 4.5 millimetres. So we've got some quite considerable distal taper here, which of course aids its balance, and the way it handles and the way it performs and cuts and moves. And so therefore nearly 1 centimetre thick at the base of the blade, going down to 4.5 millimetres rather, at near the tip. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that that's pretty thick. That is a thick blade. So despite the fact that we've got a fair amount of width on this Type 18 blade, it's also quite thick. So some of the really thick blades we find are actually Type 17s or Type 15s. They're more narrow, pointy thrusting blades than this. This is a true cut and thrust blade of pretty big proportions, over 40 inches in the blade. And being 1 centimetre thick at the base of the blade and still 4.5 millimetres thick near the tip means it's a big, beefy sword. This is not particularly light, not particularly nimble. This is a real sword of war, as some people would call it, and it's a fairly chunky design. And that extends to the hilt as well. You'll notice that the quillons here have this very distinctive swollen knob, should we say, terminal at the end of each quillon here. So you have a thick central boss section that tapers down into nice thin quillons and then thickens up at the end. And this type of guard is actually found with both Type A and Type B swords. It is predominantly found with the swords which have a fishtail pommel, but it is also sometimes found with the wheel pommel variety as well. Now you'll notice straight away that this has neither of those. It doesn't have a fishtail pommel or a wheel pommel. This actually has a circular, we could say pear-shaped pommel. And in fact, there are very few swords in this grouping which are like this. Most of the swords in this group either have a fishtail pommel or a wheel pommel. So again, I've known this one for years from publications, but it's absolutely fantastic to see it in real life, as it were, and get my hands on it. Now, obviously, this type of pear-shaped pommel, obviously the grip's missing, but when you're holding it, it does mean that the pommel can be part of the grip. Now, that's not to say that you wouldn't be able to fit both hands without gripping the pommel, and indeed if we were looking at certain German fencing treatises of the 15th century, they might tell you to grip the grip and not grip the pommel. But if we look at other period art, or if we look at other treatises like Fiore, we will see them gripping down here as well. And obviously having this shaped pommel means that you extend the functional amount of pommel there, and therefore the mass, but you turn it into part of the grippable surface of the hilt. Now, an interesting little nitty-gritty detail that some of you might like to know is that the tangs on medieval swords are often slightly thinner than the base of the blade. And this is, of course, because they aren't ground or CNC'd out of a flat sheet of steel. They are forged. And often the thickest portion of the bar will actually be at this intersection between the tang and the blade, around about where the crossguard sits. So this is around 8.3 millimeters thick that way, whereas this is around 1 centimeter, just under 9.8 millimeters thick here. So 9.8, 8.3. So there's quite a difference between the thickness there and the thickness there. Another really amazing feature I've noticed about this particular example here, which is lot 147, is that we have on the end of the terminals on the quillon, we have a little cross indentation and an incised line around. I don't know whether you'll be able to see that on camera, but let's try. So you can just see there, a little cross on the end of each quillon and around the end there. And on the other one here, you might be able to see this one a bit more clearly. There we go, on the end there and around the end around here. Really, really nice to see that level of detail still preserved, even if this quillon is bent, which could have happened in use, for all we know, could have happened in period or in the riverbed, we don't know. But having that level of incised detail and decoration visible still on the surface of the quillon is absolutely fantastic. So briefly back to the provenance of these swords. So these appeared on the antique and art market in the 1970s. And Ewart Oakeshot's belief was that they had come from probably a barge that had sunk in the River Dordogne, and this might be associated with things being taken back from the battlefield of the Battle of Castillon in 1453. Now, there are some things to support that. Firstly, although there are a large number of swords and there are variation between them, they roughly split into two main types, and there is an enormous amount of similarity within the swords. So it doesn't appear like they've been gathered over a broad area from a broad period of time. They seem to date to the same period and come from the same geographic area. And in fact, you know, I put a challenge out there. If you can find swords that are really similar to a so-called Castillon sword that aren't associated with the Castillon find, show them to me. I think there's possibly one in a German museum, but apart from that, it's very difficult to find 15th century swords which are as similar to the Castillon group of swords as any other sword from the group of Castillon's known swords. And it must be said that of the group, we don't know currently, or when I say we, researchers don't currently know where all of them are. A lot of them went into private hands through auction in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. And so many of them are in private collections around the world. But as I say, some of them are in public galleries and museums like the Royal Armouries. Now, assuming these were found in a river, does that seem plausible? I would say yes, absolutely. These show all of the signs from an archaeologist's point of view of river-found swords. So the patina, the corrosion, everything about them suggests river-found, even to the degree that some of them have some organic material remaining on the tangs and the bases of the blade. Now, the organic material comes from the grips, possibly rain guards. And in fact, this particular example does feature some corrosion around here, which very well may be the remains of either a so-called rain guard or a sort of leather flap here, or possibly the edges of a scabbard or some part of a scabbard. That being said, there is very little evidence that these swords went into the river with the scabbards, because there are no scabbard fittings. So, for example, from the Thames in the Museum of London, we've got swords which have parts of the scabbard, the chape and the locket still remaining fused to the corrosion of the blade. We don't have that with any of the Castillon swords, which suggests that they, for whatever reason, they went into their containers and went into the rivers in a way that meant they weren't in their scabbards. But nevertheless, there's some kind of organic material remaining there. There's no remains of organic material on the tang from the grip, as far as I can see, but there are on some of the other Castillon swords. Now, just also briefly talking about the condition, you can see, obviously, there is quite a lot of corrosion towards the tip here. That is the thinnest part of the blade, so it's going to be the most vulnerable to corrosion, and you can see there has been a loss of material, but we do still have the original tip, but it's obviously very fragile, and so I'm having to be very, very careful about how I handle this and put it down and all of that kind of stuff. But that being said, for a 15th century sword that spent hundreds of years in a river, we have got an amazing preservation of the edges here, and there is some edge damage. Some of it, I would say, is edge damage from use, and we do find this with a number of the Castillon swords that I've seen personally and seen good photographs of, that indeed there does seem to be so-called battlefield or combat damage on the blades. The damage on the blades is not only as a result of corrosion or being in a river and subsequent treatment, because they were allegedly dredged up by machinery. Some of the damage is there from the 15th century and does seem to be original to these swords. Now, one of the other absolutely incredible things about this particular sword, I mentioned that some of the Castillon swords have markings on them. Now, this one, I don't think in this light you'll be able to see, but just down here, we actually have a running wolf symbol, the so-called running wolf of Passau. Now, that was widely emulated, in fact, around Europe, but it does strongly suggest that this is a German-made imported blade, which is potentially very interesting, because if this sword is otherwise regarded as either French or English, then the fact that they're using a German blade, was the whole sword made in Germany? Was just the blade imported? We know from records and surviving examples that German blades, as I've talked about in many of my videos in the past, were widely exported around Europe and indeed beyond, down to Africa and over to Asia. But nevertheless, it's very, very interesting that this is a German blade. And there is a sort of association between longswords, or two-handed swords, and Germans. They are sometimes regarded as a German thing. And of course, the earliest kind of systems, very developed systems of longsword fencing that we know about are the Lichtenau lineage and other German lineages. So even going back into the 14th century, there's an association between two-handed swords and Germans. So the fact that we've got a longsword here with almost certainly a German-made blade is extremely interesting. So don't only see these as English or French weapons in this case, could even be German. So here we have the second longsword. This is lot 148 in the upcoming auction, linked below. Now, this is characterized by having the fishtail pommel. Now, this fishtail pommel, while in modern recreations, for example, we might find the pear-shaped pommels more common, and fishtail-shaped pommels like this might be less popular. In this particular group of swords, the Castillon swords, the fishtail pommels are far, far more popular and more common. Now, this longsword is slightly smaller than the other one. It's also lighter. This has exactly, weirdly, 1 meter long blade, exactly 100 centimeters long blade, and the total length is 126 centimeters. Now, much like the other example we just looked at, lot 147, this lot 148 is a thick blade. While it is an Oakshott Type 18 blade with bowed out edges and a good combination cut and thrust blade, it is a whopping 9.5 millimeters thick at the base of the blade here. Halfway down it is 6.5 millimeters, and near the tip around there it is 4.3 millimeters. Now, just for reference, there are modern replica swords that are 4.3 millimeters here, but this is 9.5, 6.5, 4.3. So it's got a lot of distal taper, and it starts out very, very thick. And in fact, much like the other sword, its thickest point is actually below the guard down here. The tang itself is a little bit thinner. Let's just see what it is there. It's 8.1. So it's actually very, very similar to the other sword. And to be honest, the proportions are so similar. This is just slightly scaled down. It's slightly shorter, it's slightly leaner, and it's slightly lighter. You could almost say that these came out of the same workshop. And in fact, looking at the aesthetics of the way they're made, I would strongly suggest that if they're not from the exact same workshop, they're from a very closely related place and tradition. They have a lot of aesthetic similarity between themselves. So I would say, yes, they're very much part of a group from the same period, the same area. So I did mention that this blade is a little bit more slender. It also has different corrosion to the other one. So it's got more material towards the tip. It's not so corroded out towards the tip, although it has lost some material up here. It has a bit of a chunk missing there and there and there. Is it possible that some of these are to do with combat rather than corrosion? It's very difficult for me to say. But on the other edge, where there is more of the a straight edge remaining, there do appear to be some of what might possibly be nicks or chips from use, either from contact with other weapons or contact with armour. It's very, very difficult to say when something's been in a river or in the ground for a long, long time. The other difference with this sword is it has slightly shorter guard, shorter cross guard. So this isn't quite, if I just carefully hold up the other one, if you can see the proportion. Now, what's interesting is actually they are very similarly sized hilts in terms of length. The one with the pear-shaped pommel in my right hand here is very slightly longer, but they are nevertheless very, very close. But you will see that the fishtail pommel has a slightly shorter crossguard than the pear-shaped pommel, but the fish pommel example, lot 148 in this case, has thicker quillons. The quillons are thicker cross-section than the other one. This is more slender and longer, this is thicker and shorter. Now, some interesting details about this fishtail pommel. It is faceted in a number of ways, very similarly actually to the Royal Armourer's example, the bigger two-handed sword that they've got there. These faces here are each essentially hollow ground. So there's essentially a midrib running down the middle of the fishtail, and then each face of this is scooped out. And then when we come round to the end of the pommel, you will see that there is actually a cross here. So a groove which runs in both directions, forming a cross, and then the end of the tang is peened the end of the tang is peened in the center just there. So very, very detailed, and there was possibly more detailing on that surface before the corrosion. So these fishtail pommels, and you'll also see it flares this way as well. You can see it's thinner here and it flares upwards. So they're actually quite complex. And when you come to make a pommel like this, and when you try to replicate a pommel of this type, you realize they are far more complex than you initially think. They're not just a flat sort of fan shape. They have got so many sort of bevels and angles and aspects to their design. Another detail worth mentioning about this particular sword, the fishtail example here, is it does have latten or copper alloy, should we say, inlay in the blade here. So it does have some markings. Now, I don't know for certain, but it's possible that they again relate to the running wolf mark, which might also imply that this is also a German imported blade. And when we look at the similarity in these two swords aesthetically and their proportions, it's entirely possible that these two blades were made in the same place, in the same workshop, and possibly hilted in different places, because we know in period that very often the blades were married to the hilts. So blades were imported and then a hilt was made locally. So it could be an English or French hilt on a German blade, which is entirely possible. And it's also worth mentioning that these blades are very, very slightly hollow ground. So if we lay a flat surface along them between the edge and the midrib, you can just see a tiny bit of light underneath. So don't think they've got a lot of hollow grinding, but they do have a little bit. So just to conclude with a comparison of these two, this is definitely the lighter and more nimble sword, but interestingly, although its total mass is less, it actually balances 11 centimeters from the crossguard. So as is often with swords, we find if their total mass is less, then you can afford to have the point of balance further from the hand. And you'll see it's not got a massively long grip. Even if I grip it all the way down the pommel here, there's not a huge amount of grip between my two hands. So this is I would say by modern standards, this is a average sized longsword, but quite a beefy one. As I say, remember that distal taper, 9.5 centimeters at the base of the blade. In contrast, the pear-shaped pommel sword here, while it is in the hand a bigger, heavier sword, it actually balances slightly closer to the hand. So this balances at 10 centimeters from the crossguard. And it has a slightly longer grip or functional grip because it has that pear-shaped pommel. So you can actually get the hand further down and spread the hands further apart. So although in literal terms the total hilt length is very similar, you can actually get your hands further apart, and that feels a little bit, at least to me, more controllable. And it is a slightly broader blade, a very, very slightly longer blade. So this is a bigger sword, but it somehow feels bigger in the hand, even though next to each other there isn't much to tell between them. Anyway, it's been an absolute honour to get my hands on these. We're now going to be looking at more weapons in the upcoming sale on the 26th of June at Olympia Auctions, but I hope you've enjoyed looking at these two absolutely amazing longswords from the legendary Castillon hoard. I'm Matt Easton. Check out the links below, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon for my next video.